in my own small way to continue this program. Very simple but very effective. Some or other people can become attached to hearing and chanting the holy name of the Lord and partaking the divine remnants of His beautiful vegetarian food. It certainly opens up their hearts.
Glory to the Glory to the Thank you very much. Hare Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama.
Srila Prabhupada leaving the temple in 197 Dank Street, which is one block off from the ocean. Beaconsfield Parade is the name of the road that goes along the ocean there. And Srila Prabhupada in the morning would walk out there and go along. Now, because Prabhupada's getting into the car, it indicates that he would be going down to the botanical gardens. Because if he was going on to the beachfront, he would just, walk. This is Prabhupada arriving in the botanical gardens there in Melbourne, which was a very beautiful place. You know that the British had the tradition of building these elaborate botanical gardens in wherever they would have their colonies, whether it was in Africa or in India. So Australia was like that too. They would have these elaborate botanical gardens that they would construct, and they would bring all these different exotic trees into one place. And Srila Prabhupada would go early in the morning, and he would come and say, they spent so much money building this, and now, look, in the morning, no one has come to take advantage of it. We're the only ones. Prabhupada would be walking in the botanical gardens at 7 in the morning, and everybody else would be whizzing by in their cars going to work. And we would be taking advantage of their botanical gardens. Srila Prabhupada would preach the philosophy of Krishna consciousness using nature. He would tell us many times that you can learn from nature. And when he would be going on these morning walks, he would point out things. And he would amaze us. Sometimes he would say, oh, this is a certain type of a tree. And he would quote the name of the tree in Latin, like he was some kind of a botanist. And lo and behold, we'd go and look at the tree, and the name would be there, and it would be that tree. And he would point out the medicinal value in the trees. And Prabhupada was very educated, not just in spiritual things, but he had so much material knowledge that he would amaze the devotees.
You could see the city from the distance, and there were buildings. And I can't remember exactly his question, but it was something along the lines of, why do they build these big buildings? And being somebody who was always a little bit in awe of architecture, I remember saying something like, well, they like to be remembered, from doing some big construction. I guess that's a sort of the fault of an artist anyway, isn't it? You do a painting or leave something behind. And Prabhupada said, that's exactly the same as the washerman's donkey. He likes to be known for being able to carry some big load. It's just no different. Yeah, the washerman's ass. I remember thinking then, I was working at the time as a designer and an artist, and I had a job in a TV studio here in Melbourne. Prabhupada sort of dismissing so-called lofty aesthetics of contemporary architecture. The mode of passion, I guess it is, isn't it? You like to work in the mode of passion, and leave something behind that you'll be known for. But yeah, Prabhupada's perspective sort of cut through it.
All of us would just pile into cars and then follow Prabhupada for the morning walk. We'd all follow behind. You'd have the leaders in front. You'd have Madhavisa, who was the GBC. Deepak, he was the temple president of Melbourne at the time. And you had a few others there. And then the rest of us would be walking behind. And it had been raining a little bit, so the grass was moist. And Prabhupada would be walking along the pathway, like a cemented pathway, and then just go straight off the pathway and walk across the grass. And so I just read just the day before that Lord Chaitanya, wherever he stepped, people would take the dust of his feet. So I thought, I should get some dust from Prabhupada's feet. And so I was walking behind Prabhupada. Madhavisa was on his right and Deepak was on his left. And then I was looking for the footprints. I could see the footprints of Madhavisa and Deepak really clearly. As you walk in the grass, it leaves an imprint quite deep, about ½ an inch deep. And I was looking, Prabhupada wasn't making an impression in the grass. So I decided that I will get right down to actually see Prabhupada's foot come off and see the grass underneath. And I was looking as Prabhupada's foot came off. The grass even wasn't bent or anything. It wasn't that Prabhupada was like, an inch or two off the ground. It wasn't like that. It appeared that Prabhupada's feet were actually touching the ground, but they weren't. I became a little confused at that time. I didn't really understand what I was seeing. And then later I read in Bhagavatam where Yudhishthira Maharaj, he never touched the ground. So I understood from that Prabhupada was a Nitya Siddha, that he was never a conditioned soul and he came directly from the spiritual world. I mean, I didn't need to see that to come to that conclusion, because by serving Prabhupada, I was able to experience within that my understanding of Krishna consciousness and my detachment from the world, as it was developing, I understood this is a pure Vaishnava. Because, serving a materialist or ordinary person, these things don't happen in the heart. But that was really wonderful to see that.
My son Janaka, who was very young at the time, probably 4 years old, and one morning walk, Srila Prabhupada took Janaka's hand in his, squeezed it very hard and kept it in his pocket all through the morning walk. It was probably Janaka, my son, that spent more personal time with Srila Prabhupada than I did. In the Melbourne temple, he used to go up to Srila Prabhupada's rooms. I would dress him in the morning and he'd disappear for the day. Prabhupada's assistants travelling with him and the other devotees would be standing guard at Prabhupada's door to his room. So Janaka knew his way in and out of Prabhupada's room, so he'd sneak in through the side window and spend the day with Srila Prabhupada. He'd play boats in the bathroom when Srila Prabhupada slept. Sometimes he would sleep under the bed there with Prabhupada, take prasadam with him.
When we were on morning walks, Prabhupada would, of course, be chanting japa, and then we would follow in unison. And then Prabhupada would stop and he would say something or point out some philosophical point. He would walk on again and everyone would start chanting japa. And this little Mataji, Ramaniya, her name was, her chanting was over and above everyone else's chanting, very loud. And sometimes you couldn't hear what Prabhupada was saying. You had to really snuggle in around Prabhupada as close as you could to actually hear what he was saying. And so you might hear, someone chanting japa in the background, not knowing what to do when they couldn't hear what Prabhupada was saying. So then Ramani was chanting this japa very loud, and everyone else was thinking, oh, she's chanting so loud. You could kind of feel the vibe of the devotees. Tone it down, please. And then Prabhupada actually commented, she's chanting very nicely. This is good chanting. So that put us in our place.
Prabhupada had gone out on his walk and something needed doing in Prabhupada's room. I don't recall exactly what it was. I think it was to tidy up. There must have been a lot of devotees in there before he went for the walk. Anyway, I was feeling Prabhupada's potency in the room. I was feeling very low and dirty and unclean, and what are you? Who are you? to put yourself before this exalted person. I could recognise that. You know, he was just so glorious. And I think you should go away out of the sight from this man. You don't belong here. I was actually thinking that in my mind, yeah. And as I thought that, the front gate there opened, and Prabhupada looked straight up at me and beamed a big smile and called me down to greet the deities. So I went down and went in the temple. So that sort of dissipated any doubts. I thought, well, if Prabhupada's accepting, then I felt freed from that. And I served then for 16 years non-stop, 18 hours a day.
I stayed behind to do the room and get the room all ready for Srila Prabhupada, and I would always be downstairs and open the door when Prabhupada came in, and there was a huge kirtan. And Prabhupada came in, and I had some flowers in my hand, and Prabhupada walked up the stairs, and in Melbourne there was an area where you got halfway up the stairs, and there was a landing, and then you went further up. And Prabhupada walked up the stairs, and Prabhupada turned around, and the kirtan was louder and louder, and Prabhupada looked down at me, and he saw I had the flowers in my hand. He walked back down the stairs and took the flowers out of my hand and walked back up the stairs. That was pretty far out.
Why there are varieties?
They say originally there was just a cell, and by adaptation, in some circumstances one kind would live and another would die, so all these varieties adapted to different conditions.
Who adapted?
Well, they just
Who managed?
accidentally.
That is nonsense. Nothing happens accidentally. That is nonsense. There must be some arrangement. What is happening is accidental.
Well, they say
Why you are taking care of the trees? So many things. Nothing is done accidentally. You do not see the cause. Let accidentally money come and sit down. Why do they not do that? If accident is there, let accident come and I'll become rich man. Why they try? Why they go to the college? Let accidentally become MA, PhD. This is all rascal. There are 5 causes. Activity, the place, the proportion of energy, and ultimately sanctioned by God. Then things happen. Otherwise, there is no question of accident.
Srila Prabhupada really made a point about the neck beads should always be tight. They were, bought off the shelf somewhere in Vrindavan, whatever, so they wouldn't be tailor-made for the devotees' necks, so they'd usually be just loose. But even though they were put on loosely, Srila Prabhupada insisted on a number of occasions that no, they must be tight. I think it's got something to do with remembering the beads are there, and that we're servants of the spiritual master like that.
I remember I was very nervous, of course, going before Prabhupada to receive an initiation. Is that me there? I think so. Put on about 40 kilos since. I was worried that I would forget before rules and regulations, so I said no illicit sex, no gambling, no intoxication, no meat eating, like that, to try and make sure I didn't forget. And then Prabhupada said so many negatives, because I was stressing the word no, as though it was abhorrent to give these things up. And Prabhupada said, isn't there any positive? And then I said, chanting Hare Krishna 16 rounds.
There were a number of occasions when I was involved or sat in or was part of initiations. Srila Prabhupada always insisted that the doors and windows remain closed. Devotees would open the windows like as if the smoke coming from the fire was a botheration. I don't know exactly why, but he would insist that we just keep the doors and windows closed. It didn't matter. The smoke was not harmful.
There was a chaise lounge that he would sit on when the guests came. He would sit there and preach to the guests. This was a very big room. All the devotees could actually fit. It was almost as big as the temple room. One particular preaching engagement was with a social worker from the Department of Social Welfare. We actually rang up the departments and tried to get the ministers to come and meet with him, but the minister couldn't come, but he sent one of his top men. And this man came along, and actually he was very, very nervous. And I don't think he actually wanted to be there. Anyhow, he met with Prabhupada, and he was respectful. And then Prabhupada started to tell him about our principles, and how one of our principles was no illicit sex. And when Prabhupada mentioned this, this man became very, very agitated. And Prabhupada kept talking about this, and this man became so agitated that in the end he wanted to cut the conversation. Although Prabhupada was giving him the answers and the solutions to so many of their social welfare problems, this man was not willing to listen. Prabhupada's preaching was very powerful, but they were not willing to hear. And also on the same visit, he met with one man whose name was Brian Dixon. And Brian Dixon was a very, very famous man in the state of Victoria. He was a very famous footballer. And later on after that, he became a politician, government minister. He came with his secretary, and she was not dressed very appropriately. She had a short dress, she had the makeup on and everything, and she was very provocatively dressed. So Brian Dixon came in and met Srila Prabhupada, and he made the comment straight away that he saw the Hare Krishna devotees on the streets singing and dancing and chanting, and whenever he saw them, he saw that they were always happy. So he asked Srila Prabhupada, why are you successful? And he knew that we did not participate in taking drugs. And he was impressed by this, and Prabhupada explained that we follow 4 principles, and one of them is no intoxication, and that by chanting Hare Krishna you become happy. And Brian Dixon, he was listening. So then Prabhupada mentioned that we do not engage in illicit sex, and Brian Dixon became embarrassed. He blushed like anything. Almost immediately he looked at his watch and said, oh, sorry, I've got another appointment, and he had to leave. So Prabhupada was preaching very, very strongly, and he was giving these particular men the answers to their problems that they were dealing with. But again, they were not willing to listen or to implement this particular program. Then again, we had one newspaper reporter come from the Age newspaper, which is the main Melbourne newspaper. And Srila Prabhupada preached to this man for about 45 minutes. Simply preached to him about you are not this body. Straight preaching. Although the man was asking general sort of questions, Prabhupada just stuck with this one point of how you are not this body and you are the servant of Krishna, and he just preached to the guy full on, and the guy just sat there and listened. So then the next day he wrote a very, very nice article. It was about half a page on the second page of the Melbourne Age, quite an extensive article and very well written, because most newspaper reporters, they actually misinterpret what the original message was. And we showed Srila Prabhupada the newspaper article the next day, and he was so pleased that he asked us to get 12 copies of that particular article, and he got his secretary to send them to some of the big life members in India.
He would hold darshans there some evenings in his room, and he'd sit and talk, and Prabhupada would display his usual erudite knowledge. But he had this compassion that he would hear everyone and consider. Even if you spoke, you could only feel foolish in front of Prabhupada, but he seemed to tolerate. And he had a lot of compassion. But at the same time, with the guests that would come, he would show a lot of interest, but he would not tolerate the subject being moved. So he would be very quick to bring the subject back within the Krishna conscious domain, even if he would insinuate that they were in illusion. He did it in such a way that nobody was ever offended. Prabhupada had this knack of speaking to people. So in Melbourne, I remember he spoke to one of the parents of a devotee, and he made them feel extremely comfortable. But at the same time, Prabhupada was very strong in stressing that Krishna consciousness was for everyone and not just a sectarian movement, but it was for everyone, and it was a practical movement. Prabhupada had this skill of disarming people's defense just through his purity and his straight speaking and his simple language. And it was understood by everyone. There was nothing duplicit in his language. It was straightforward.
My uncle, Father Wallace, he was a Jesuit, but he was in charge of the whole of Victoria, so he's like the head Jesuit. I said to my mother, I'd like to get my uncle to meet Prabhupada, so somehow she got that arranged. My mum was pretty good at arranging those things. And so my uncle came, and we're all sitting around in Prabhupada's beautiful room on the beautiful blue carpet, and he was sitting back in the chairs, and he was quite elegant sort of a guy, and a very good speaker. As the Jesuits are pretty well trained in philosophy, Prabhupada spoke philosophy with him quite a bit, and he seemed to be able to follow the thread of it and answer it, which most people, when they met Prabhupada, they kind of lost it. Prabhupada was just probing into what they understood, and they couldn't understand what they believed themselves, but he seemed to have some belief himself. Anyway, it went on for about, I guess, 3/4 of an hour, having a pretty lively conversation, but jokey too, a lot of laughter and so on. And then finally the session was over, and he got up and shook hands and left, and we're all sitting around Prabhupada, and Prabhupada sitting there just kind of rocking a bit. And I said, Srila Prabhupada, what did you think of my uncle? And Prabhupada looked at us all and he smiled, and he looked at me, he said, a very pleasant drunkard. And that was like, we just all cracked up laughing, because immediately he walked in, Prabhupada must have picked up he'd had something. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was a regular drinker. He had that kind of look, his face, a bit over reddish. And yes, it was pretty well strong through the whole order at that time, I'd say, the whole Catholic Church. That was the one thing the priests could do, have a good drink. But the way Prabhupada could crack a joke was really amazing.
The minister is elected according to public will in our society.
Because they have made a department just like your, what is the department?
Social welfare.
Social welfare. So if they find social welfare, why not help? Why they bring politics? If actually there is social welfare here, why they should not support it?
Yeah, well, you're right. But in our society, minister is elected to carry out certain policies. Not what he wants, but what the people sort of voted for. And they are taxed to support.
And if your policy is social reformation,
social reform is not our policy.
The social welfare.
So just to look after those who are in trouble. That's our policy.
Everyone is in trouble.
What?
At the present moment, even the ministers are in trouble.
Yes, but that is not what our function is. Everybody's in trouble.
Physician heal thyself. You see? They are also drunkards, they are also woman hunters, and meat eaters, and gambling, that's all. They require to be rectified.
But we can't help that. That's society. You have to go and change society. The society tells us to act differently.
Unless you change the society, how you can make social welfare?
Well,
if you keep them as it is, then where is the question of welfare?
Give it a different interpretation to the word.
How this? I don't...
Does you understand me?
Basically,
yes.
Basically, one must be first class ideal man.
Yeah.
That is one.
That's why it's so very difficult. You have to work on your own, and always have to see that you have freedom to work. And if you convince enough people to go your way.
Our own program, it is not box properly. You find out fault with us.
What?
You find out what is our fault.
I can't see any fault.
Then you can disagree. But when you see everything is nice, how you will not accept it? Unless you are biased.
Of course I'm biased. I've been brought up differently.
Yes. That's like our...
That is your bias against my life.
No, we are not biased. We say like we are not biased. We are allowing. We say that if you want to be first class man, then you must not commit sinful activities. That is our problem.
But I as a public servant, I'm not here to change society.
Well,
Society
we are
tells
also
me
public.
what to do.
We belong to the public. You must become our servant also.
Yeah. But?
We are public, members of the public.
Yeah.
So you should become our servant also, if you are public servant.
A public servant is, in our philosophy, is a man who serves a minister elected by the people. And this way he serves the public.
Yeah.
And what the public decides, it votes accordingly.
We are reforming the public. Just like we are proposing here. I am not proposing. Krishna says that one must be peaceful. But how to become peaceful? If his mind is always disturbed, how he can become peaceful?
Quite right.
So that is the secret of success. You want to make people peaceful, but you do not know how to make him peaceful.
Yeah.
So therefore you have to adopt this.
You have a competitive society.
Yeah. We say that you chant Hare Krishna, eat here sumptuously, live here comfortably, and you become peaceful. It is guaranteed. If anyone, even a madman, agrees to this principle, that let him chant Hare Krishna mantra, take whatever nice food stuff we prepare, take, and live peacefully. He will be peaceful.
What's your answer that still such a small percentage of the population, tiny percentage of the population, accept a philosophy that sounds so
tiny percentage, just like there are so many stars in the sky, and there is one moon. In percentage, the moon is nothing. If you take percentage of the stars, the moon is nothing. But moon is important than all the nonsense stars. But if you take percentage, there is no percentage both. But because he is moon, he is important than all.